Medical Branch, and I will be your moderator for this talk. And we want to acknowledge that people might be missing this because of the Yom Kippur holiday, but this talk will be recorded and posted for those who are unable to listen today. So Dr. Chris Gunter earned her PhD in human genetics at Emory University, studying Fragile X syndrome and mechanisms of dynamic mutation. After her postdoctoral work on X chromosome inactivation, Dr. Gunter served as a senior editor for the journal Nature, handling the areas of genetics, genomics, and gene therapy. Her last position was an associate professor in pediatrics and human genetics at Emory University School of Medicine, where she served as the PI for several grants on both autism genetics and dissemination and outreach. In January 2020, the National Human Genome Research Institute, or NHGRI, appointed Dr. Gunter as the Senior Advisor for Genetics Engagement. In this role, Dr. Gunter advises the NHGRI Director and the Institute on issues and challenges associated with communicating the science of genomics and the applications of genomic medicine. She also leads a research unit in the Social and Behavioral Research Branch and is currently pursuing studies on genetic literacy and the backlash against autism genomic studies on social media. Throughout the talk, if you think of any questions, you can go ahead and post them in the chat, and I'll ask them at the end of the presentation. So please go ahead, Dr. Gunter.
Thank you so much. And that was me texting my teenager who's off for the Yom Kippur holiday to stop talking in the background. Yeah, that's, y'all all know you've been at home with Zoom and everything. Let me share the slides here. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and talk to you all today. Let me put this into presenter mode. And I told Sadaf, if y'all have, hopefully you can see everything, if y'all have any questions along the way, please let us know, and she's welcome to interrupt me. I understand that everybody is in a junior faculty career stage, and so that is great. I have seen some of the questions that y'all sent in, and a lot of them are kind of nuts and bolts questions on Twitter. So I think we're going to answer quite a few of them during the talk today. I reconfigured some of my talk to be more geared towards some of your questions. But if at the end, if there's anything else you want to talk about, obviously, please feel free to ask questions then. So I'm going to talk today about science and social media. Obviously, that bird on the bottom is telling you that it is totally okay to tweet what I'm talking about. My handle is Girl Scientist, but I'm more than welcome to tweet some of what I'm talking about today. And what I'm going to talk to you about is exactly what my title says, that just doing the science is not enough. It's really important to also communicate about your science to any audience that you can. So I know you're already thinking, oh my gosh, I have such a busy day. How do I fit that in? And we're going to talk about that a little. So yeah, there we go. So really, if you take away nothing else from my talk, this is the graphic that I want you to take away, which is that your science is really the nucleus of an entire ecosystem that has developed around science communication. So it's not, again, just doing your science, and this is not new. Even back in the day, Darwin just coming up with his ideas about evolution wasn't enough. He had to communicate them, right? Which in this case took many, many years, right? So you also have lots of different and new ways to communicate your science. And what I hope today is that you will come away thinking that you can do this. You are qualified to take advantage of some of these. So there's preprints that we won't talk about too much today, but I'm on full disclosure, I'm on the affiliate group for bioRxiv, and which is one of the main preprint servers. So I absolutely encourage you to take advantage of preprints on bioRxiv or medRxiv. Traditional journals, again, it's a different talk. We won't talk about that much today. What we're going to talk about is social media. There's also post-publication peer review, which is a separate topic that I'm happy to talk to you about some other time. But today we're going to focus on social media. But let's take a step back first and think about, why would you even do science communication? So this is a slide that I made over a year ago, and I just updated it and 2 days ago with new tweets. You can see here on the bottom. Why do we need more effective science communication? Here are 4 great examples, right? Which is more likely, lightning strike or severe reaction to a vaccine? It's actually a lightning strike, which is more likely. This is a 2020 study that talked about how a quarter of all tweets then, I'm sure it's even worse now, about the climate crisis were actually produced by bots. And then 2 from the last week. Here's someone talking about how, I don't know if you've seen the latest, but betadine is the latest supposed COVID cure or treatment by some of the anti-vaxxer groups that they're sharing amongst themselves, telling each other to either drink betadine or put it onto tampons. don't encourage either of those, obviously. And then the last one is yesterday, or I guess on the 14th. What day is it? 2 days ago. It's all written together in the pandemic. This was the bestseller on Amazon on books, was this book which is by a well-known COVID denier and anti-vax person. So why do we need effective science communication? Because the other side, so to speak, who's putting out ineffective science communication, is quite effective at misinformation. So we need to be able to combat that. So a lot of us use this model still. You may have heard of this already, the deficit model of science communication. And that has 3 tenets. The first 2 are that the public has a deficit of scientific knowledge. That's generally true. I have a deficit of how to be a car mechanic knowledge. That's not what I trained in, right? So we've trained a lot in that. We have more scientific knowledge than most of the quote unquote general public. And a lot of us feel the second tenet, it's our responsibility, particularly when taxpayers fund our knowledge, to give that to the public and to help people make decisions, right? To give them accurate knowledge. But where we tend to fall down is this third tenet of the deficit model here. We think that when other people have knowledge, they will act like you would act, or you think they should act in their subsequent decisions. And I feel like the COVID pandemic has clearly shown that's not the case, right? People don't act how you think they should act when they have the information in front of them. And that's because that doesn't reflect reality. People's heads are not empty, right? They don't always make rational decisions with new information. A lot of us might be in the same decision. I love my car. I might not make the rational decision to sell it if stuff's starting to break a lot and get a new car because I love it so much, right? Even though if I were more logical about it, I could see that money-wise, it might be better to get a new one, right? Similarly, don't always make rational decisions with new information, and they definitely don't act how you think they might act. So that's just something that you need to know when you're talking about your science. And on social media, you will get very quick feedback. And I can show you an example of that in a little bit. So multiple social science studies over the years, and if you're not interested in social science, I really suggest that you read a few things about that because that can help you a lot with your science communication. And they've shown over and over, human brains are hardwired to dismiss facts that don't fit into their worldview. And here's an example of it on the right. This is a Pew Research Center study that asked, at that time, this was early 2020, do you think it's most likely that the current strain of coronavirus was made in a lab? And the red category here is, do you think it came about naturally? The yellow, the various shades of light yellow were, it's made in a lab, either intentionally or accidentally, and the gray is, I'm not sure. And you can see that overall, about 43% of US adults said they think it came about naturally, but that is wildly disparate amongst different groups. So by gender, it's different, by ethnicity, by age, by education, and by political party and leaning, which we've seen a lot about. So it is true that some political parties and other forces may be using this to divide people, but you can also think about some of these targeted approaches to help you communicate your science, which is how do you get parts of your science across in a way that may not divide people, but instead allows people to come with some preconceived notions and then hear about your science and be able to take that into their worldview. So that's really tricky. That's something that I work on a lot. But that, if you're serious about science communication, I would encourage you to think about it that way. Is how are people going to come to this knowledge? And how can I reach sometimes people where they are, particularly if you have a goal in mind? So tell us in the chat here, or think of this to yourself. When it comes to social media, which we're going to talk about today, which of these memes are you? My teenager and I fought a lot about which memes to use here. So are you A, the shruggy? I have no idea what's going on. Are you B, the lurker on the bottom? How do you do, fellow kids? I watch social media, but I don't actually participate on it. Are you C, the I kind of know what I'm doing dog, who's famous? Or are you the D, the doge, the much expert, such strong skills? So y'all can think about that. I see some things coming up in the chat. I have gone from being the A to now being in the D range, and I'm hoping to get y'all to at least the C range, maybe being able to share if you want to, what you're doing in social media. Okay, so again, that's what we're going to talk about today, is how social media can fit into this entire ecosystem for you. So I'm going to focus on Twitter primarily because that is what I have the most expertise in, and that is the one that I use for work. So someone asked in the questions, I believe, how do you decide what platform to use? I think it's totally up to you. There are people who are really great on Facebook communicating science. That's awesome. There are a lot more people now who are using Instagram to do that. If your work deals with a lot of images, Instagram. There's TikTok, right, which I'm not hip enough to be on really yet. And there's also Twitter, which has pluses and minuses. So Twitter is I have gone through the journey of, I started in 2008 joining Twitter. And I at first got definitely even my boss at the time, and even some of the younger postdocs at the place I worked would be like, I can't believe you're wasting your time on that. Don't you have science to do? And around 2014, I started to see people saying, oh, all the cool kids are doing it. And I appeared in the same year, I think, in Cell and Nature and Science in news pieces as an interviewee talking about why I use Twitter. So that's a good sign that it's getting acceptance. And around 2019, when these screenshots are from, there were data that demonstrate its effectiveness for actually helping achieve career and funding goals. I will say in 2019, given what was going on in the country, it became a lot less fun to be on Twitter. And in 2021, I think it's safer, particularly if you use the mute and block function, which I strongly encourage you to use judiciously. I view Twitter, one of the main reasons that I'm on it is it's a great place to hear diverse voices that I would not be exposed to possibly otherwise going about my daily business. So to me, that is one of the greatest strengths of Twitter, is that you can curate your timelines and feeds so that you hear a lot of diverse things. And I benefit from that, I would say, almost every day, is that I see someone talking about something and I'm like, oh, wow, I would never have thought of that. So I think that's one of the great strengths now. I want to show this, and I'm not picking on Emory. It's just that I was just there and talked to them about these guidelines. So I know where to find them. So my pro tip for you is you want to find out what the social media policy is at your institution, because you want to know that before you have gotten into trouble, and you need to know it, if you know what I'm saying here. So, and notice that it is quite different. So the top two at the time were screenshots in 2019 for faculty, where it was more, the policy was more kind of like, hey, y'all, we trust you, and here's how, if you want to set up a social media site to help your research study, then here's how we'll help you do that, right? But it wasn't a lot of guidelines, and these are our policies, and this is what you can say and not say. Whereas the bottom screenshot there is for the medical students, and that is very clear. You can see behavior of students in the academic setting and beyond must be in keeping with the ideals of the institution. This is our standards for your behavior on social media, right? So look not only at your institution, but then at your faculty status. What are the guidelines for faculty on social media? You will want to know that before you put a lot into this. So I'm going to walk you through these. These are the best tips that I have for successful science communication. And really, just we're going to walk through each of these. But what I want to show you by having them all together here is that this is, I'm almost telling you that doing science communication is like doing any scientific study in a way. You have know your desired outcome and audience and your message. That's basically your hypothesis, right? Your number 3 here is actually knowing your methods. That's your method section. And then number 4 is your results and discussion. Basically, you did it. How did it work out? Did the people that you want to reach, did you reach them, right? So it's basically like writing a paper or doing an experiment. So let's look at the first one, the first 2. For me, these are screenshots of mine, my Twitter page for the last day or 2 on the left. And you can see that I'm actually verified. I think someone may have asked about that. So not many people are verified. You can see that when I took the screenshots in January, I was not verified. I'm only verified because I work for the government now. And so they have a separate track for people who actually are government employees to get verified. Does it mean anything? Not really in my experience. So it's not something that I would worry about if I was not, per se. But you can see NIH specifically has several policies for how you can use your Twitter accounts. They can either be official Twitter accounts, like my boss, NHGRI director, has a Twitter account. He does not run that. That's run by the communications team. He may suggest tweets, but he doesn't actually write them. It's all posted by them. That's one way to go about it. Francis Collins is similar. He doesn't actually write those. They're posted by someone else. And then there's the second option, which is that I have to say that I work for the government, but the tweets and views are my own. And there are guidelines for what I should say and what I should not say. And the third option that we have for the government anyway is that you have an account, you don't say anything about where you work on there, and then you're more free to say whatever you want, although in this day and age, I certainly would not go wild saying whatever I want per se. But yeah, so that's the 3 options that at least we have in the government. So your institution may offer some kind of similar breakdown as to how they expect Twitter accounts to go. And so on the right are 3 examples of how I have used Twitter. If you can see, the top one is me reaching out to a younger autism researcher and saying, hey, my group and another lab group talked about your paper in our journal club today, and we really liked it, right? And so that led to some dialogue with her. I think that's really great if you can tell people, I don't know about y'all, but if you've put papers out there, often sometimes you just don't get any feedback, so you have no idea how they landed. So I think it's really nice to tell people when you read their work, and especially if you appreciated it, right? I think that's great. The second tweet here is me passing on information about one of our plans to make the workforce more diverse in genomics. That's my main reason for using Twitter, is to share information about what we're doing and what we want to reach and that kind of thing. And the third is me talking, this is a more personal tweet. So some of you asked about how you draw the line between work and personal. For me, I sometimes talk about things that are going on in my personal life, in part because I think it is important for people to realize that scientists are also people, right? That we also have some of the same general public things going on, right? We have to do all kinds of stuff. And for me, both my parents still live in Georgia, and that was me staying up past midnight to get vaccine appointments for them in Georgia, because they're both over 70 at the time. So, and you can't see here, but there were also angry tweets from me later saying the system told me they had vaccine appointments and they actually didn't. So I ended up staying up till 3 a.m. a second night to try and get them appointments. So curses. But to get back to the question of the line between work and personal, for me, I talk about my kids sometimes, but I have always called them kid. I've never used their actual name. I don't also post pictures of them. That's my line. I don't want pictures of them on Twitter where anyone can see it. For me, Facebook, which is locked down, and Instagram, which is even more locked down to be a private account, that's where I talk about my kid and use pictures and stuff. So that's just my own personal line. Everybody can decide for themselves where they want to be. So getting back to our how to do science communication, for me, the desired outcomes are really science communication, talking about science, sharing resources, like you can see in the middle tweet there. And as I mentioned, hearing voices that I wouldn't hear otherwise and being able to interact with them. So those are my desired outcomes. And my audience is the science community. So I'm trying to reach other scientists. Like here, I'm sharing about how we want to make the genomics workforce more diverse, and that's primarily aimed at those who are applying for grants and might apply for some of our opportunities. The science curious, I have people write to me who are curious about science and have questions. I'm also specifically trying to reach students and trainees to try and share resources with them. So for myself, that's who I'm aiming at. So I think you have to decide that for yourself. You may be trying to target funding agencies because you want them to notice your work. That's cool. You can aim your tweets that way. You may be wanting to reach other collaborators, or you may be wanting to reach family or advocacy groups on a condition that you work on. All very real audiences that are out there that you can make your tweets tailored to accordingly. So that's the first two. And then you also want to know your message. So for me, it's personal genetics and human genetics. I'm a human geneticist, and genomics. So for me, this is good validation that this came out of nowhere a few years ago, where a biotech company had who to follow on Twitter for the latest personal genetics. And that was me, right? One of them. There's a list of, I can't remember how many, but I was one of them, which is great. That's good validation for me that that's what I'm trying to do. And hey, they saw that. So that's good. So again, you want to think about your message, and it may change over time. Mine certainly has over the time I've been on it. You also want to tailor your communication method, your platform. We talked about different platforms, your style to reach your desired audience. So here's just two examples of that. So the one on the right, let's start with that one. That was me saying, hey, the NIH is doing its overall strategic plan. I know, because I see y'all talking about it on Twitter, you all have thoughts about it. Please submit them. And you can see that I only got 16 likes on that and 8,000-ish impressions, that's how many people may have seen it during the day. So that's okay, but I would love for more people to be invested in the NIH strategic plan. But on the left, you can see that I was responding to Jen Heemstra, who is at Emory also, and is someone that y'all might have heard of. She does a lot of career advice as a chemist. And so I was responding to her with a meme, and this was a meme where a woman reaches forward and that a blank space there, right? It has been 0 days since I was mansplained. May be able to relate to that sometimes. That got many, many, many more likes, right? And over 56,000 impressions where people saw it. So yeah. Am I telling you that memes will help you reach more people? That's probably what I'm telling you. So think about that and how you're, doing your communication, et cetera. Is you can have some fun and try to reach out to people. So that's how it goes. And then the last tip here is evaluating. So if you have a Twitter account, you will have a Twitter analytics page. So this is, again, a shot of mine from 2 days ago. You can see at the top, I don't check this very often. I actually only check this when I'm about to give a lecture on science communication. So other people use it a lot. For me, I'm more kind of just doing Twitter and then occasionally I check in on this. So you can see at the top, it gives you the summary of how active I've been and how many people have looked at what I have said. I have gained some followers, which is great. That's not why I'm in this, but whatever. And I haven't been as active in tweeting, and you can see correspondingly that my profile and mentions and everything have gone down. I just haven't been on there as much in the last month because back to school, things going on. It also tells you the top tweets. So far in September, my top tweet was telling people that they should look at this new resource paper that talked about social and behavioral genomics, which I thought was pretty important. You can see that your top mention. So I was mentioned by Dr. Wojcik here, who gave a seminar for us, and she basically posted a whole thread, which we'll talk about in a minute what threads are, talking about her whole talk. And so lots of people have engaged with that because it's good information. So you can see that's my top mention there. Whoops. It tells you who your top follower is. That's great. Yeah. And then your top media tweet. And so for me, this is what I tweeted on September 11th, is trying to get some flowers out there for people who were still processing that. So yeah, if I want to spend more time thinking about who engaged with that, I can dig in here. You can also think about other ways that science communication can be improved. So as I'll tell you at the end, that's part of what my research focus is on how to work on the science of science communication. So I would love to talk to any of you if you have ideas about that. Call me later. Okay. So one of you asked, how does one bridge the world of peer-reviewed papers and the world of likes and comments? So I put that question up here. So one way to do that are these. I see this much more in the last year. Twitter threads, they're called, or tweetorials. So this is increasingly common as a way to share what's in your new papers, or used by experts to talk about new data or things like that. So you can see on the far right here is Dr. Chang, who used 3 tweets, and you can do this by replying to your previous tweet. If you're posting them, then it will thread them together. And so you can see he is using 3 tweets here to talk about a new paper that they've had come out. Most often, that's what people do, 3 to 5 tweets saying, hey, here's what we found in our paper. Some people go figure by figure and present all the figures. That's fine also, as long as the journal lets you use figures, which they should. It's totally a good idea. So that's a way to get your paper out to more people who can just read the Twitter thread and may not have time to read the whole paper. And then there are other people who have turned this into an art form. And one of them is Carl Bergstrom. If you don't follow him on Twitter and you're interested in someone who is using Twitter in a different way, I recommend it quite a bit. He is a statistician who also spends a lot of time in the COVID realm. And so you can see this is a 27 tweet thread here at the time. This was a few months ago with his opinions on the current data on whether or not schools should be reopened in the time of COVID. So for him, tutorials are really an art form for him, and that's cool. There are other people who do this too. You know, Eric Topol, if you follow him on Twitter, that is an MD who's out in San Diego and has spent a lot of time threading together new papers that come out and talking about those. So people in particular, Eric has leveraged that to become seen as an expert, and now he's interviewed on TV and etc. for his expertise. That's just something that I personally have not felt like I want to put as much time into that, to spend the time to do that. If you want to be seen as an expert in your area, this is one way to go about doing that. So I hope that answered your question about one way that you can bridge the gap between the two of those. Twitter chats can be a great way to reach a desired audience. So here's an old example from 2014 of where I participated in a Twitter chat at the International Meeting for Autism Research. So Twitter chats are where a number of disparate people all answer questions, generally posed by someone, a moderator, on the same hashtag. So if you follow a hashtag, in this case it was hashtag autism chat, I think, or IMFAR chat, I can't remember, that you can see the questions that are asked. So the moderator, who is the Simons Foundation for Autism Research, would pose a question, how do y'all feel about this? And then we would all answer, and you could see those all in one place. So what I love about that is, and this is in 2014, so it's quite some time ago, you can see that we had this many impressions. That's 4.4 million almost. If even a fraction of those people saw us saying that autism is not caused by vaccines, then that's a pretty good science communication day, in my opinion. Yeah. So Twitter chats can be a great way for a group of you to kind of boost your message and get things out. Can you do Twitter wrong? Absolutely. You can be this guy right here. I'm going to give you a second to read this. I actually saw this happen at the time. I just happened to be looking at Twitter. And he had advice for PhD applicants at the time who were obese, which is you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation. Obviously not true, obviously ridiculous, not a good idea to post that, right? So what happened to this gentleman? What happened was, at the time, he had an appointment at the University of New Mexico and had a visiting appointment at NYU when he tweeted this out. You can see 4 hours later, someone has gotten to him and said, what you doing there, man? So he has posted 2 tweets saying, I'm really sorry. That doesn't reflect how I feel. That doesn't actually represent what I'm saying. Yeah, 4 hours later. And so the consequences for him, he said his defense was that the tweet was part of a research project. And so y'all have done research. What's the first thing that you got to do in research? You got to get IRB approval, right? So NYU and his home university both said, so let's see your human subjects approval then, if this is part of a research project. And obviously he didn't have one. So what happened, his appointment at NYU was terminated, and then he went back to UNM and was formally censured and had to have all of his work supervised for quite some time. So you can see that spelled out there. So I've been showing this example for a long time. And when I was making this talk 2 days ago and today, I thought, you know what, I should check and see what's going on, because I feel kind of bad that I've talked about this guy. I mean, this is really not cool, but maybe I should check up on him. And as it turns out, just like a few minutes ago, this guy actually now has a new account. Today, our institute, you can see in this bottom part here, tweeted a commentary, which was written by a colleague of mine, which talked about an anti-racist approach that can help pursue diversity in science. And you can see that this guy posted just almost an hour ago now that woke identity politics has captured the NIH, and you won't get any money unless you're woke identity politics. So in my opinion, he's still doing Twitter wrong 8 years later. That is my opinion. So yeah, I don't feel as bad now. So let me show you another way that you can undermine your science communication. And that is this guy, who I should be talking to you about how amazing his work is. And that's it. That's all I should be talking about. But unfortunately, when he went out to the really big press conference talking about his and his group's work of landing a lander on a moving comet from a spaceship that was going by, putting a lander on this comet, that's amazing, right? That's a huge accomplishment. Unfortunately, when he went out to the press conference, he chose to wear this shirt, which you may not be able to see, but it actually depicts scantily clad and dubiously clad women on it. So it's really not an appropriate message. And you can see that this spawned its own hashtag at the time, Shirtgate, because people were focused on that, absolutely undermined the science he was trying to communicate. He apologized later. It was a bad choice, and I believe he really regrets that. But the problem is it sends a message. And so I want to point this out for 2 reasons, that his science communication was absolutely undermined. But at the same time, here are some of the tweets that were responding to him. And if you don't know Astro Katie, she's an astrophysicist, Katie Mack. My teenager and I just listened to her book about how the universe is going to end. If you're into that, I totally encourage you to listen to it. It's really good. At the time, she said, I don't care what scientists wear, but a shirt featuring women in lingerie isn't really appropriate for a broadcast if you actually care about women in STEM. And then a science writer, Rose Eveleth, took a more sarcastic approach, saying, no, just ask the dude in this shirt. Dude, people are totally welcome. And she had a few tweets after that. And I want to show you those to make another point, which is science communication environment many times is not equal or fair. And in particular, women often get a lot more pushback than men do for saying the same thing. So here's an example. Rose Eveleth here was actually what we call doxxed. So someone went online and found her home address and put it out there. And she wrote a column here about, and the URL is at the bottom, about what her experience, and people made her home address public, sent pictures of themselves outside her house saying, come outside, we want to talk to you, that kind of thing. So, and then before Boris Johnson was the PM in the UK, he actually wrote a UK newspaper column talking about how horrible it was that they had dared to question whether this guy would wear this shirt at a press conference. So not equal or fair. This is just, I personally have not had this happen to me. I do have an ambiguous name, Chris, so I often wonder how much of that is people don't know. My handle is Girl Scientist, so you should kind of know it's a woman though. But I don't often get as controversial, I would say, as Rose does. She's willing to go out there a little more than I am. So has not really happened to me, and certainly never to this extent, but this is something that I think you need to keep in mind as you're going on Twitter, that blowback happens. Yeah, and we just saw an example of it with the commentary that we just put out today, my institute, and not 30 minutes later, there's someone saying all kind of bad stuff about it. So shouldn't discourage you. I just want you to keep that in mind. So let me finish here in this last section with some more practical advice. Again, a number of your questions were really practical, kind of nuts and bolts. I want to do this. How do I go about doing this, etc. So what I've done is add a section here focusing on a column that came out in March 2020 by Liz Neely, who is an amazing human being. I encourage y'all all to look up her work. She's just such a lovely person. And this is a column she wrote about how to talk about the coronavirus. And I think it's good. I'm going to walk you through the 4 recommendations she had and give you some examples of how I've tried to apply those in what I'm doing. And I hope that will help you think about how to do science communication too. And I should mention this talk is all my opinions and I'm not speaking for the NIH. I just want to say that one more time. So her first recommendation is that you start where you are. Most of you may not realize, because you may spend a lot of time with other scientists and that's kind of your peer group, that you are a nerd of trust for people who are close to you or even people who don't yet know you. So if you have a friend who's a realtor, for example, that's the first person you would go to ask questions about house prices or should I buy a house or whatever, right? That's who you would start with. You're a nerd of trust. You're a scientist. People are going to come to you and they look to you for having some of the best information about things. And you don't have to just believe me on that. This is a paper that came out in 2017, which actually surveyed a number of scientists and talked to them about how they use Facebook, and then surveyed their followers and asked them how they look at those scientists. And so that's one of the places that this nerd of trust phrase came from. It was coined before that, but talked about it. This is a great piece if you're interested in thinking about social media and science. This is a great paper, I would say, for you to look at. And I also would show you different poll results. So this is an older poll before COVID, but this is a survey that showed that medical scientists and scientists overall were the most trusted group at that time. Again, this is pre the Trump presidency and a lot of misinformation. But the data that I have seen since then still show that scientists are generally quite trusted. So it may not feel like that all the time, but really people do want to hear what you have to say, and you do have trust to build on there. And so just as an example, here's someone who's been very, very busy as a nerd of trust, right? So here's Dr. Fauci on Jesus and Mero in the middle there on the Alan Alda podcast. Apparently in the middle bottom, he's a superhero, which I did not know, and was in a comic book, even also going on Fox News. And this one on the top right, I don't know where that is. And then also talking to Steph Curry on Instagram on the left there. So Dr. Fauci, very busy nerd of trust, right? And so he has, as if you have looked how he's done things over the COVID pandemic, he has worked to stay very impartial and be that nerd of trust over time. So that's someone to look at. So the second recommendation that Liz makes is that you need to pick your battles. When you're talking to people, it's really, really difficult because it's hard not to try and make sure they have all the right information. So you kind of want to pick on every wrong thing they say, but you might want to step back and think about what's the most important. If you're going to have a battle with someone, in this case, she's talking about her dad, what's the most important place to start and the most important misinformation to go after? And so she's saying, you know, I may hate the politician that my dad once voted for, but I love my dad and he loves me, and we can build on that, right? And talk about that. So think about what you have in common with people and use that as a starting point to help you communicate about your science. And for me, just an example of this, when I made these slides, was a week last year where we had a documentary called The Gene that was on PBS, which obviously I have to encourage you all to watch. And you can see in the left that I tweeted, we think that the genes are only about 1% of the DNA in our cells because the rest is the rest of the entire genome. And you can see that someone answered me and said that we should spend all of our taxpayer money understanding how the mitochondrial genome controls the rest of it. So I'm going to pick my battles. I don't know who this person is. I have no idea. That's not really something we're going to do. So I did not respond to that. Whereas a week or two later, I was talking about preprints online, and here's a gentleman who's the CEO of Sigma Xi, which is the Scientific Honor Society, and he responded to me and said we should treat preprints as a dangerous weapon, which I cannot disagree with more. No, that's not what they are. So I ended up having a whole discussion with him online and proposing a research project, which maybe we should think about doing together. So that's still maybe in the cards one day. But to me, that was worth having a quote unquote battle, like actually engaging with this person and talking about it. So you can't respond to everyone. You want to make sure you respond to the places where you think you can do some good, and then start from a shared understanding that you have. So getting near the end here, Third, you want to avoid unforced errors. And I'm going to tell you right up front, I find this the most difficult, and I'm going to show you an example why. So when you repeat misinformation, you inadvertently reinforce it. And again, I'll show you an example of this. So instead, what Liz suggests is starting off from, I'm worried that you may have been hearing reports about the medicines and the coronavirus. Some of the information out there is very wrong. Not starting off with, oh my God, why would you put betadine on a tampon and put it, what are you doing? Why would you do that? That's probably not the first place to start with what she's saying. Is to start off with saying, I'm worried that you've been hearing about some of this. Can we talk about that? Some of the information is just not right. So here's an example that I saw, which I think is interesting to discuss. So this is something that came out in the beginning of the pandemic. The New York Post had a headline that said, Bill Gates has created the coronavirus to microchip people, which, yes, obviously wrong. And this reporter, the way that they tweeted this is, I see the New York Post has decided to go full InfoWars. And then this gentleman, Brendan Nyhan, is a well-known science communications scholar, and he responded saying, what you've done is wrong. What you're saying is irresponsible person made false or unsupported claim headline is terrible journalism. So don't amplify misinformation. So what's kind of the problems here? The first one is what people suggest that you do is this first person did not link to the original paper. Instead, they put a screenshot in there. So that's what a lot of people tell you to do if you want to call out some kind of misinformation, is not put a link to the original paper, because that will drive more traffic to it, but instead have a screenshot of it. So, and also that's easier because people can just see it right there instead of having to follow it. But what I would say is bad about this is Ryan didn't actually explain why the headline is wrong. He just said, I see they've decided to go full InfoWars. Well, you would have to know some kind of background. You'd also have to have some opinions about InfoWars in order to see what he means there. So he didn't explain why he thinks it's wrong. And then Brendan also didn't explain why it's wrong. He just said, you're doing this wrong. This is wrong, right? And so Brendan is bringing more attention to it, and actually himself is also amplifying this information, right? So this is kind of hard. This is maybe advanced level if you're getting into social media, but this is something to keep in mind, because I'm telling you, I've seen, just checking Twitter, I would say twice this morning for a few minutes each, I've already seen like 30 things that I want to retweet with, what are you doing? But that's not the best strategy, is what I'm saying. So you want to think about what's the best and most effective way if you want to call out misinformation. And the last one here, the last tip in this, is to be as honest and transparent as possible. So you want to recognize the limitations of your own expertise. That's important. You see lots of armchair virologists now on Twitter, right? So I don't want to be one of those, and instead point to people who are actually working in the trenches and are doing some of that. If I wanted to talk about Ebola, I would point to those experts, for example, maybe not try to have my own expertise. And you also really want to allow yourself to step away when it becomes too much, which it will. If you're on social media for any length of time, it will just become too much. You want to not be this lady in the famous meme here, who has been later made into a meme yelling at the cat, but you want to be able to step away so that you can step back in when you really want to make sure that you're needed. So that's just something I would tell you to keep in mind if you're going to really get in there. So I'm going to end there. Again, just think about how your science can be helped and moved along by looking at different science communication. And I just want to end by saying that I actually have a small research unit at NIH called the Engagement Methods Unit, or the EMU. You know, everything is acronyms in the government, so I was pretty proud of myself for coming up with EMU, I have to say. And this is part of what we're doing, actually, as a research agenda, is developing novel tools and modes of science communication and public engagement, and then evaluating how they worked. So I'm really excited to start getting into that. Would love for collaborators, or if you have any ideas, please, again, call me, tweet me, email me, anything like that. And here is how to reach me on those. So I will stop sharing so that we can see everyone, and I would love to talk to you about ideas or take questions.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. That was great. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat and I can read them, and I'll just start reading from the list of questions that were sent in previously. A lot of those were covered. This was a great talk. So first, how do you start building your online following?
So that's a great question. So if you're just starting out on a platform, I'll just, again, take Twitter as an example. What I would do is start following people that you are interested in. So if I was just starting in human genetics, I would probably follow the American Society of Human Genetics. I would follow the Human Genome Institute because obviously. And then I would also follow, there are a number of prominent geneticists who are quite active on Twitter. So I would follow me, for example. I would follow colleagues of mine who talk quite a bit about stuff. So there's someone named Leonid Krugliak, who's at UCLA, who tweets a lot about stuff. There's a friend of mine, Daniel MacArthur, who's in Australia, who tweets about. So I would just spend kind of some time and follow those people. And then the next step would be to start tweeting your own content. And then when you do that, you can tag relevant people in there. So if I was talking, for example, about something that was relevant to the Genome Institute, you can tag them in your tweets, and then they'll see that, and they might decide to retweet that, which will help you be seen by more people. Hopefully you're saying something good and not something that's not that great if you're going to go with the strategy. And I don't mean good like positive, I mean like useful. Yeah, so I think kind of cycles of that, and then also reaching out and having conversations, commenting on other people's work. This is, I found this really great. Have you thought about this? Again, that kind of thing. That's how I would kind of start that cycle.
Well, so I think starting out can be kind of intimidating, especially for junior faculty who are on the call right now. So what would you say to those who are worried about, their social media presence opening up a new level of scrutiny?
Yeah. So I think I would say in general, and this is my approach to, for example, my LinkedIn profile, which is either you can control what's said about you, or people are just going to talk about you in the absence of you providing data. So in my mind, it's better to have at least a minimal social media presence. So when people look you up, they will find you and have in your profile, if you work on hematology, to have that in your profile so that when I search for hematologist on Twitter, I find you, for example. I think it's hard to think about. I think you want to think about, again, what your purpose is, and know that Twitter can be seen by anyone, right? So it's easiest to make it a more professional account. There are people out there who succeed in posting stuff about their kids. So if, like Jen Heemster is an example, who is also at Emory. She's a chemist. She talks about her kids all the time. She talks about her own personal life, etc. She gets blowback for that, and people kind of sometimes make fun of her. That's just part of putting yourself out there sometimes. So you just kind of have to go where you're comfortable with.
God, that's great advice. And so you mentioned having like a minimal presence at least. So how bad is it to have, for example, a Twitter account and not post that often, maybe 1 to 2 times a month?
Yeah, I don't think that's bad at all, right? I think absolutely. There are tons and tons of people who only post 1 or 2 times a month. So there's a whole genre of Twitter accounts which are basically only on broadcast. So they're not interacting with anybody else out there. They are basically just posting stuff every so often. That's fine. That's definitely one approach you can have. That's not a way to like build a whole following, but that may not be why you want to use Twitter. It may be that you, Sadaf, just decide, I want, when people look up Sadaf, they'll find me on Twitter and they will see me saying, we had a paper come out today. Yay. I had a fellow start today. That's awesome. Right. And not really interact with people, but they'll still see updates on what you're doing. Totally fine.
That's great to know. That was going to be my follow-up question, is if you're just posting your own things and not interacting, if that's okay. So that's good to know. So what about privacy? If I was gonna, post a picture, would I have to get permission from all my lab mates in the picture, or do I have to get permission for tweeting the paper? How does that work with Twitter?
So tweeting the paper, no, definitely not. You should be able to tweet the link to the paper at any point. A number of journals also will, like the Nature journals, give you a special link through something called ReadCube, which is that you can tweet a link to the paper and they don't have to have a subscription to see the PDF, but people can't download it or print it. Right. So journals, in fact, are encouraging you to do this, and that's one way they're going about that. If you published in a journal that has a graphical abstract, that's a great thing to tweet. Here's the graphical abstract of our paper that lends itself to Twitter or Instagram or somewhere that is images. That's really great. Or if your institution puts out a press release or something for your paper, 1000% you need to be tweeting that out. They're going to tweet that out, hopefully, or put it on Facebook or whatever. I think that would totally do that. So in terms of privacy, yeah, I mean, that's just the same with any social media. If I was going to put up a public picture of people, I would just check with them and make sure it's okay, unless it's a very public arena, like, hey, we went to the park today and there's people in the background, like, you're not going to ask them, usually speaking. So, and in terms of other media, yeah, I think making sure that you have the rights most of the time, but most stuff that is publicly posted, you're more than willing to do that. I will say one exception is when you go to conferences. So, for example, our society, Human Genetics, you can take and post pictures of posters if they have a special, we give the authors a special kind of card to pin at the top of their poster that has a camera on there that says it's okay to take pictures. And there are others that have a slash through it so you cannot take pictures. You shouldn't do that. But our policy is that you cannot take pictures of the slides during the talks and post them because we're more worried about disruption. So that's an example where you need to know the conference policy before you go in, so you make sure you're compliant with that policy.
Okay, great. So if you're trying to expand social media in your university department or college, what is the workflow for submission of materials by others? How do you go about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I can speak to Emory because I was just there and actually worked with them quite a bit and talked to them about that. Most of your colleges, institutions, universities are going to have a communications team, and they want good stuff. They are like begging for researchers to work with them to have more stuff to help them put online, right? So you're not bothering them by saying, hey, we have this paper coming out. Like ideally, they want to know that 2 to 4 weeks in advance so they have time to write something up and maybe come up with a cute video or graphic or something like that. So really, some people at our institution, they ask us to tell them when we have submitted a paper so that they have so much lead time. In fact, I'm being asked, we have one that's under review, and I'm being asked, okay, so we want to work on a press release. And I'm like, hey, let's get it through review first. Hold on. Right? So I have the opposite problem. So yeah, you just really need to talk to your communications office and find out, make a contact there and find out what's their preferred workflow in terms of sending stuff. Generally, they have science writers and they want you just to send them papers or send them material and say, hey, can you tweet this out? They have their own standards, which they can walk you through. So they're not going to put out everything. So just know that. Don't get mad at them because they can't put out everything. But they are often generally begging for you to send them stuff so that they know what you're doing too.
Great. So you would suggest then getting in contact with the communications person since it seems like it's institution specific.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can even go slightly further. So for example, when we had I used to run the Grand Rounds series at our Marcus Autism Center, which is the largest one in the US for clinical care. And I would invite some of the communications team, the science writers, to some of our internal lectures so that they could see in depth what our people were working on and how they were doing and get ideas and stuff. And they really appreciated that. So I would go a little bit further and actually try to have a relationship with them and invite them to talks.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. So a lot of your presentation focused on knowing your audience and tailoring your message to them. Twitter is pretty big and there's all types of people on Twitter. So how do you manage, if you want to kind of reach out to a larger audience, how do you manage that heterogeneous audience?
Yeah, well, that's a difficult, specific question. So I really think, again, there are many different Twitters. So for example, what people call science Twitter is generally speaking quite a supportive place. There are people who, will complain about experiments that are going wrong and others that will step in and be like, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Like you can find a lot of place there. I have seen other people who have talked about problems they're having with getting their promotion through, and people have contacted them kind of behind the scenes and help them out. So I really think it's your comfort level and what you're looking for. So I think, again, particularly if you're just starting out, using hashtags can be a great way to do that. So there's one called AC Twitter, which is academic Twitter. There's a hashtag Sci Twitter. There's, hashtag promotion or whatever. Like there's all kind of different hashtags. So I would kind of look around and see if the topic that you're interested in is a hashtag, and that's a way to reach a wider audience as well, is to use the hashtag. This is a style thing. I am not one of those people who put like 6 hashtags in something. That just seems, what are you doing? Plus Twitter, you have limited characters, so that's not a good idea. But yeah, that's one way to reach people, is to get on there. And particularly, so for example, like conferences for our ASHG meeting in Human Genetics, the ASHG 21 hashtag, there's like hundreds of tweets on it every single day. So, and lots of people are following it. So that's a great time to put out something that's relevant to the meeting, not in a spammy way, but we have this poster, come see us, etc. So yeah.
Great. And so, what do you do if your post is taken out of context by the media? I think that can be a very scary part of Twitter, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, and so I would make the analogy to publishing a paper in PubMed. So 90% or slightly higher of papers that are put out there, y'all may know this, are never cited once. Right. So a lot of us think, and I don't mean to say that to depress you, a lot of us think more people are going to read inside our work than they do. And that applies to Twitter too. So I would say a lot of people may let that keep them from getting involved in social media. Really, yeah, it's actually quite difficult to go viral more than you think, even though it may not seem like it. I think, just employing common sense, looking at the standards that your university has for behavior, if they have them, that's good to know. There were other faculty who tweeted stuff at Emory that I was like, oh, yikes. And they are fine because the behavior wasn't spelled out, right? So I didn't see them getting any kind of action, whereas other universities are more proactive about that. So I think knowing those and using common sense, again, if I want to respond to this guy who called our commentary woke science, and if I put a whole screed out about how awful that is, I should expect that there may be consequences for that. So instead, I'm just talking to y'all about it. But yeah, I think, just make common sense. But the question actually was, what if it does happen to you? The number one first thing to do is contact your communications office, because they have crisis communication plans, and they would call this crisis communication. So they will help advise you on what's going on. You may also, if it really is that bad, which certainly won't be, you might want to tell your department chair, just so they hear it from you and not someone else, and tell them that you're already working with the communications office, you have a plan in place. That's the way I would go about it.
Okay, great. So it seems like the communications office is very useful.
Yeah.
So this is actually a question from me. How do you deal with the frustration of all the misinformation on Twitter? Sometimes I go on Twitter and just seeing all of that gets really frustrating.
Yeah.
Especially in science communication.
Yeah. So this is how I personally deal with it. A couple strategies: muting and blocking. There are periodic debates that go on where particularly those people who have blue checks should not be able to block anyone because blah, blah, blah. I completely don't agree with that. Twitter is only a place that I want to be in if I can block prominent misinformation. You can also report tweets that are misinformation, and so I do that sometimes. And Twitter has just in the last month added specifically a way to say that something is health misinformation or is political misinformation. So you can do some of that to help the system. I would also use it. I personally use a program called TweetDeck for the Mac, and the way that program works, it doesn't give you just one whole column like if you go on the website, but instead TweetDeck allows you to filter tweets into columns. And so I find that really useful, so that I just have one column, which is the unmitigated feed, but then you can also follow a specific hashtag, so I can only see things relevant to, for example, something I'm interested in. You can also make lists. So I have a list of people who talk about autism all the time. That way I don't have to follow them. But in TweetDeck, I have a column, which is this group of people who talk about autism. And I'm aiming for different perspectives. So some of them are people I really might not want to follow, but I can see what they're saying in this Twitter thread and just be like, okay, all right, that's what you're saying over there, right? So I think that's one way to go about it. And the second part is you don't respond to a lot of that. You just can't. You could drive yourself crazy by trying to respond to everything. You just can't, right? And there are people, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, who that's their whole ethos, is to try and stir up controversy. So they're tweeting stuff that they know is wrong, right? But that's their business model. So I would just ignore that and focus on people talking about science.
That's some great strategy. So this is my last question, unless anyone wants to throw a last minute question in the chat. So realistically, when do you find the time to do all this social media? Is it after hours? Do you allocate work hours to this form of science communication, or do you delegate to lab mates?
Yeah. So yes. The answer is yeah. No. So for me, I have cleverly worked it in so that monitoring Twitter is part of my job description. That's what being a senior advisor is, and also doing research on science communication. So for me, it's part of my job description, which is kind of nice. But generally speaking, I get this question quite a bit. I think we all decide where to spend our time. So for example, I don't get the table of contents from certain journals. Like, I don't do that. I almost never watch TV news. Just that's not how I do things. I get a lot of my news and also news about papers from Twitter. So I personally, I would say check Twitter maybe 2 or 3 times a day, depending on the day, just for a few minutes, just to see what's going on, right? And if there's something really important, that'll come up. So how do I manage time to tweet? You saw from my stats, I tweet maybe once a day, maybe once every few days. It's usually like 3 tweets a day and then nothing. So I think particularly once you decide on what your goals are and what your objectives are, it's pretty easy just to spend 5 minutes putting something out. So that would be my advice, is kind of integrate it into your workflow.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. That's good advice. So those are all the questions I have, and nothing has come in through the chat. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And just a reminder to please complete the survey that will appear once you exit the webinar. And also please stay tuned for the announcement on the speaker and date for the next webinar. So thank you so much. And thank you for giving us such an incredible presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all being here. And any questions afterwards, feel free to contact me.
Thank you.